Have you ever stopped to consider how the entire modern world was forged in the fires of a single catastrophic misunderstanding? On June 28, 1914, a wrong turn by a confused chauffeur in a sunlit city set off a chain reaction that would ultimately claim the lives of over 20 million people. It wasn't a grand, calculated master plan by evil empires. It was a cascade of rigid alliances, bruised egos, and bureaucratic panic. Today, we're unraveling the exact 7 days in 1914 that destroyed the old world and birthed the modern nightmare of industrial warfare. But how could one single gunshot echo so loudly that it shattered the globe? The morning of June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, Bosnia, was bright and unusually warm. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was visiting the city with his wife, Sophie. He was there to inspect the imperial armed forces, a blatant show of power over the recently annexed territory. But the streets were lined with a mix of cheering citizens and silent, seething nationalists. Among them were 6 young men, armed with bombs and pistols hidden in the crowd. They were members of the Black Hand, a secret Serbian nationalist society determined to free the South Slavs from imperial rule. As the Archduke's open-top motorcade slowly cruised down the Appel Quay, the first assassin, Mehmed Bashik, froze. He later claimed he was blocked by a police officer. The second, Nedeljko Čabrinović, took action. He hurled a bomb at the Archduke's car, but the bomb bounced off the folded-back convertible roof and exploded under the car following them. The blast injured the occupants of the trailing vehicle and several bystanders. In the chaos, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were unharmed. The Archduke calmly handed his wife a smelling salt, and the motorcade sped away. The first attempt had failed. The assassins scattered, believing their mission was over. But history has a cruel sense of humor. After the failed bombing, Franz Ferdinand insisted on changing his schedule to visit the injured officers at the local hospital. However, no one had properly communicated this route change to his driver, Leopold Leuke. Driving down Franz Josef Street, Leuke realized his mistake and slammed on the brakes to reverse. The car's gears ground to a halt. And where did the car stall? Right in front of a delicatessen owned by Moritz Schiller. And who had just walked out of that very shop, resigning himself to a quiet defeat? The 19-year-old assassin, Gavrilo Princip. Princip couldn't believe his eyes. The target was sitting motionless just a few feet away. He stepped forward, drew his FN Model 1910 pistol, and fired 2 shots. One bullet struck Sophie in the abdomen. The other hit Franz Ferdinand in the jugular vein. Within minutes, the heir to the empire and his beloved wife were dead. But did the death of 2 royals really have to trigger a global cataclysm? The answer lies in the toxic web of European diplomacy. Europe in 1914 was divided into 2 massive, heavily armed camps. On one side, the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and the British Empire. On the other, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. These weren't just friendly agreements, they were ironclad secret military treaties. When Austria-Hungary investigated the bombing, they found evidence linking the plot to Serbian military intelligence. They wanted to crush Serbia once and for all. But they knew Russia would intervene to protect their Slavic allies. So Vienna turned to Berlin. On July 5, 1914, German Kaiser Wilhelm II issued the infamous blank check. He promised Austria-Hungary Germany's unconditional support, no matter what action they took against Serbia. It was a catastrophic diplomatic blunder, fueled by the Kaiser's belief that Russia wasn't ready for war and that Britain would stay neutral. Emboldened by this absolute backing, Austria-Hungary drafted an ultimatum to Serbia, delivered on July 23. It contained 10 impossible demands, including the right for Austrian officials to operate on Serbian soil to investigate the assassination. It was designed to be rejected. Serbia accepted all but one demand, offering international arbitration instead. But the machine of war was already in motion. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28, exactly 1 month after the assassination. When Serbia only partially accepted the ultimatum, Austria-Hungary felt insulted and, backed by Germany's blank check, declared war on July 28, 1914. But this wasn't just a local Balkan conflict. The dominoes were set, and the first one was already falling. Russia, viewing itself as the protector of all Slavic peoples, could not afford to let Serbia be crushed. On July 30, Tsar Nicholas II ordered the full mobilization of the Russian army. This was the moment the trap snapped shut. In Berlin, the German High Command panicked. They were bound by a rigid, unforgiving military doctrine known as the Schlieffen Plan. This plan was designed to avoid a two-front war. It dictated that if Russia mobilized, Germany must immediately and overwhelmingly attack France through the north, bypassing the heavy French defenses along the direct border by sweeping through neutral Belgium. The entire plan relied on precise train timetables. Millions of men, thousands of locomotives, all moving in a perfectly choreographed dance of destruction. To the German generals, mobilization was not just a political warning, it was the actual start of the war. If Russia mobilized, Germany had to mobilize, and if Germany mobilized, it had to attack France immediately. So on August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. 2 days later, on July 3rd, Germany declared war on France. But to execute the Schlieffen Plan, German troops needed to march through Belgium. When the Belgian ambassador presented the ultimatum to the Belgian government demanding free passage for their armies, the Belgians famously replied that they would reject it with a categorical no. This invasion of a neutral country was the final red line for the British Empire. Britain had signed a treaty in 1839 guaranteeing Belgian neutrality. On August 4, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. In the span of just 7 days, a regional dispute in the Balkans had engulfed the entire globe. The machine was in motion, and the leaders of Europe realized, with dawning horror, that they had lost control of it. But why did the people allow it? Why didn't the working classes of Europe rise up and refuse to fight each other? Because in the summer of 1914, war was still romanticized. It was seen as a noble, cleansing adventure that would wash away the corruption of the modern industrial age. When the mobilization orders were posted, massive cheering crowds gathered in the capitals of Europe. In London, Paris, Berlin, and Vienna, young men sang patriotic songs, believing they would be home by Christmas. They marched off to the train stations with flowers in their rifle barrels, smiling for the cameras, completely unaware of the mechanical slaughter that awaited them. They were walking into a world that had been fundamentally altered by the Industrial Revolution, but their military tactics were still stuck in the 19th century. The generals had not yet learned the terrible lessons of the American Civil War or the Russo-Japanese War. They believed that morale and the bayonet charge would triumph over machine guns and barbed wire. They were catastrophically wrong. As the summer of 1914 faded into autumn, the sweeping maneuvers of the Schlieffen Plan ground to a halt at the First Battle of the Marne. The armies dug in. From the Swiss border to the North Sea, a continuous line of trenches was carved into the earth. The war of movement was over. The war of attrition had begun. Imagine the shock when those smiling soldiers, expecting a glorious cavalry charge, were instead thrown into a muddy, rat-infested hell. The Western Front became a 400-mile scar across France and Belgium. In the trenches, men lived shoulder to shoulder in waterlogged ditches, surrounded by the stench of cordite, rotting flesh, and the constant, deafening roar of artillery. This was not the war they had been promised. This was industrialized slaughter. To break the deadlock, both sides turned to science and industry, unleashing horrors previously unimaginable. In April 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres, the German army released 168 tons of chlorine gas against Allied troops. It was the first large-scale use of chemical warfare. Soldiers drowned in their own fluids as the yellow-green cloud burned their lungs. Soon, both sides were using phosgene and mustard gas, forcing men to fight in suffocating, itchy masks while the earth around them turned toxic. But the war wasn't just confined to the muddy trenches of the West. It was a truly global conflict. In 1915, the Allies launched the disastrous Gallipoli campaign, attempting to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war and secure a sea route to Russia. It resulted in over 500,000 casualties on both sides, including a young Winston Churchill, whose political career was temporarily ruined by the failure. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the vast distances prevented the stalemate of trenches, but the Russian army, poorly equipped and led, suffered catastrophic losses against the German and Austro-Hungarian forces, eventually leading to the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the collapse of the Tsarist regime. By 1917, the war had bled Europe dry. The French army was on the verge of mutiny, and the British were facing bankruptcy. But then, two massive events shifted the balance. First, the Bolshevik Revolution took Russia out of the war, allowing Germany to move hundreds of thousands of veteran troops to the Western Front for one final massive push in the spring of 1918. Second, the unrestricted submarine warfare by Germany, specifically the sinking of American ships, finally dragged the United States into the conflict. The arrival of fresh, unbroken American doughboys, bringing with them vast industrial resources, tipped the scales. By the autumn of 1918, the Central Powers were collapsing from within. The Austro-Hungarian Empire fractured along ethnic lines. The Ottoman Empire crumbled. Germany, facing starvation from the British naval blockade and military defeat on the front, erupted in revolution. On November 11, 1918, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns finally fell silent. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was supposed to be the peace that guaranteed a peaceful future. Instead, it was a vindictive, dictated peace that crippled Germany with impossible reparations and redrew the map of Europe, ignoring the very ethnic tensions that had sparked the war in the first place. The empires of the Romanovs, the Hohenzollerns, the Habsburgs, and the Ottomans were gone, replaced by fragile, unstable republics and mandates. So, was it truly the war to end all wars? Far from it. The 20 million dead, soldiers and civilians alike, were merely the down payment on a century of violence. The unresolved grievances, the economic devastation, and the psychological trauma of the Great War planted the exact seeds that would bloom into an even darker, more terrifying conflict just 20 years later. The wrong turn in Sarajevo didn't just start a war, it broke the world, and we are still living in the shattered pieces today.